My wife demanded, "My sister and mom are moving in. If you can't handle it, it's over." I said, "Okay, it's over." I packed my bags and left the house, which was a rental in her name. Now she, her mom, and her sister are all panicking about rent. I 34 male and a logistics manager for a mid-sized shipping company. And if there's one thing my job has taught me, it's that you have to look at the numbers and the capacity before you load the truck. Unfortunately, I ignored every single red flag in my own marriage until the engine blew out. I've always been the provider type. I thought that's what a good husband does. My wife worked part-time at a boutique, basically making enough for a car payment and her daily coffee runs, while I covered the rent, utilities, insurance, groceries, and her credit card debt. And I mean all of it. The real strain, though, was her family. Her mother and sister are the kind of people who think the world owes them a first-class seat just for existing. And Mile hasn't worked in a decade due to self-diagnosed chronic fatigue that only seems to flare up when there's a job application involved, but disappears instantly for a casino trip. SIL is 25, healthy, and quits every job she gets because the managers are toxic, which usually just means they asked her to show up on time. For 3 years, I held a strict boundary. They could visit, but they couldn't stay for more than 2 nights. I knew if I gave them an inch, they'd take the whole house. But the explosion happened on a random Tuesday. I came home from a brutal 12-hour shift, completely drained, only to walk into a wall of tension. All 3 of them were sitting in the living room. The TV was loud. There were takeout containers everywhere, paid for by me, obviously, and my wife didn't even say hello. She just pointed to the armchair. She told me to sit because we needed to talk. Immediately, my stomach dropped. She told me that her mom and sister were being evicted because their landlord was selling their duplex and they had nowhere else to go. I felt that rush of adrenaline you get before a fight, but I tried to be reasonable. I offered to help them look for an apartment, maybe even help with the deposit. And Mile cut me off immediately, crossing her arms and looking at me like I was a help. She said they weren't moving into some dump and that they were moving in with us. I looked at my wife, waiting for her to be the partner I thought she was. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom rental. One room was our bedroom. The other was my home office, which is non-negotiable for my work. There was literally no space. My wife didn't even flinch. She just waved her hand and said they could take the office. She told me I could work at the kitchen table and that her sister would sleep on the pull-out couch in the living room until they figured something out. I put my foot down. I kept my voice calm but firm and said absolutely not. I told them it was too small and it wasn't happening. That's when my wife stood up and decided to nuke our marriage. She walked right up to my face, banking on the fact that I'm a guy who hates conflict and usually just pays to make problems go away. She looked me in the eye and said that they are her family and they were moving in tomorrow. Then she dropped the ultimatum that changed my life. She said, "If you can't handle it, if you can't support my family when they need us, then it's over." The room went dead silent. I could see MIL and SIL smirking in the background. They thought they had won. They thought I'd fold, apologize, and start dismantling my desk. But something in my brain just clicked. It wasn't anger, it was just pure clarity. I looked around the house we'd lived in for 4 years. She lived there before I met her. When I moved in, the landlord, an old-school guy named Mr. H, never bothered to write up a new lease. He just knew I was the one sending the checks. The lease was technically, legally, 100% in her name. So I asked her to clarify. "You're giving me an ultimatum? Them or me?" She lifted her chin, totally arrogant, and said, "Yes, them or you." I just said, "Okay, it's over." The smirk fell off SIL's face instantly. My wife blinked, looking totally confused, and asked what I meant. I repeated her own words back to her. She said if I couldn't handle it, it was over. I couldn't handle it. So we were done. I didn't wait for her to backtrack. I walked past them into the bedroom, grabbed my 2 large suitcases, and started throwing my clothes in. My wife followed me, doing that nervous laugh people do when they realize they miscalculated. She told me to stop being dramatic and that I wasn't going anywhere because this was my home. I zipped the first bag and told her, "Not anymore. You broke up with me. Remember?" She started shouting that she didn't mean it like that, and that she just needed me to compromise. I told her that moving two adults into a 900 square foot rental and taking away my workspace isn't a compromise. It's an invasion. I grabbed my laptop, my external hard drives, and my lockbox with my passport, birth certificate, and car title. As I walked the front door, Emile was whispering to SIL, looking more annoyed than worried. They still didn't get it. They thought I was just taking a walk to cool off. My wife screamed at my back that if I walked out that door, I couldn't just waltz back in when I realized I was wrong. I turned around one last time and told her I wouldn't be back, and wished her luck with the rent. I drove straight to a motel, blocked her number for the night, so I wouldn't have to listen to gaslighting, and honestly, I slept like a baby. The next morning, I went into full logistics mode. I called my bank first thing. We had a joint checking account for our household bills, but my paycheck hit my personal savings first before I transferred the money over. I canceled the scheduled transfer for the first of the month, which was only 5 days away. I removed her as an authorized user on my credit cards. I changed the passwords to my streaming services, Amazon, and utility portal. Since the electric and internet were in my name, I scheduled a disconnect for 3 days out to give me a window to get the rest of my stuff. When I unblocked her, my phone practically vibrated off the table. Dozens of texts and calls alternating between anger, "Where are you?" and "Mom wants breakfast." I ignored all of it and texted a buddy of mine who runs a moving van service. I told him I needed a favor and a witness. We pulled up to the house at noon. My key still worked. Inside, it was already a disaster. MIL. And SIL had already moved boxes into my office. My desk was shoved in a corner, and my monitor was face down on the carpet. MIL was in the kitchen eating a bagel, and she actually had the nerve to complain that the internet was being slow. My wife came running out of the bedroom, looking exhausted. She started trying to talk about groceries, completely ignoring the fact that I had bags in my hand. I cut her off and told her I was moving out and that my buddy was there to help me load the furniture I bought. She lost it. She screeched that I couldn't take the furniture. I calmly pulled out a folder where I keep my major receipts, something I've done for years for insurance purposes. I told her I had the receipts for the TV, the sound system, the couch, the dining table, and the bed I bought them from my personal account before we were married or from my personal funds. They were mine. I told her she could keep the coffee table since she bought that. For the next hour, it was absolute chaos. She tried to block the doorway. She screamed. She cried. She threatened to call the police. I actually encouraged her to call them. I told her go ahead and tell them that a resident is removing his property after she issued a verbal eviction. She didn't call because she knew she was losing control. MIL stepped in then, trying the shame tactic, yelling that I had a legal obligation to support my wife, and I couldn't leave her with nothing. I just said, "Watch me," as I unplugged the 65-inch OLED TV. By 2 p.m., the house was stripped. I left them the mattress because I'm not heartless, and I didn't want it anyway. Plus the kitchenware and her old sofa. As I was loading the last box, my wife stood on the porch crying. But it wasn't sad crying, it was panic crying. She whispered, asking who was going to pay the rent because it was $2,400 due on Monday, and she only had $300. I told her she should have thought about that before she moved 2 more dependents in. I reminded her the lease was in her name, and the landlord would expect that check. I drove away and rented a quiet studio apartment. But entitled people don't just give up. They double down. 3 days later, the dirty trick started. I got a fraud alert from my bank. Someone tried to cash a check for $2,000. She had found an old checkbook I left in a junk drawer. I declined the transaction, flagged it as fraud, and called her immediately. She screamed that she needed the money because the landlord was threatening to evict them and her mom needed medicine, calling me financially abusive. I told her that forgery is a felony, and if she tried it again, I wouldn't just block it, I'd press charges. She went on about how I promised to take care of her, and I reminded her that I did, until she decided I was disposable. A few days after that, I got a call from a detective. My wife had filed a police report claiming I had stolen her grandmother's ring and $5,000 in cash when I moved out. She was trying to use the cops to leverage a settlement. I went to the station voluntarily. I sat down with a detective and showed him the video. See, when my buddy and I were moving my stuff, I had my phone in my shirt pocket, recording the whole time, just in case things got violent. It recorded everything I touched. I showed the detective the footage. It showed me packing my clothes and electronics. It showed me clearly bypassing her jewelry box on the dresser. It showed the empty safe where she claimed the cash was. The detective watched the video, sighed the sigh of a man who hates domestic disputes, and told me they wouldn't be pursuing it, and he'd be having a stern talk with her about filing false reports. That backfired on her, but the financial pressure was breaking them. Mr. H, the landlord, called me on the 15th asking where the rent was and complaining about noise. I told him I didn't live there anymore, that we split up, and I moved out on the 28th. He was confused because she told him I was on a business trip. I told him the lease is in her name. I have no legal obligation to that property, and he needed to collect from her. He served a pay or quit notice the next day. Then MIL showed up at my work. I was walking to my car, and she blocked my path, looking disheveled and frantic. She started screaming that I was a selfish prick for letting my wife be homeless when I have savings. I told her that if the three of them all got minimum wage jobs, they could afford the place easily. She screamed that it was my duty because I'm the man. I told her my duty was to my partner, and she chose her mother over me, so now her mother could take care of her. She banged on my car window as I drove off. The final act of entitlement was a legal one. My wife hired a lawyer who filed an emergency motion for interim spousal support, claiming I had abandoned the marital home and left her destitute. She wanted me to pay her legal fees and the rent. I hired a shark of a lawyer named Sarah. We went to court for the hearing. My wife was there, dressed in modest clothes she never wore, trying to look like a victim. Her lawyer spun a sob story about financial abuse. Then my lawyer stood up. She presented the bank statements, showing I paid for literally everything for years. She showed the text messages of the ultimatum where she told me to leave. She showed the police report regarding the false theft accusation to destroy her credibility. But the lease was the silver bullet. My lawyer explained to the judge that the petitioner is the sole leaseholder, and she chose to invite 2 additional adults into the home against my wishes, which caused a separation. She argued I had no obligation to subsidize a living situation I was forced out of. The judge asked my wife if it was true her mother and sister were living there. She whispered yes. He asked if they worked. She said no. He asked if she worked. She said part-time. The judge denied the request for emergency support immediately, stating that this was a short-term marriage and the separation was caused by her unilateral decisions. The fallout was fast. Without my income, the house of cards collapsed. Mr. H filed for eviction the following week. Since the lease was in her name, the eviction went on her record, which is basically a death sentence for renting anywhere decent in the future. I heard from friends that the house turned into a war zone. MIL and SIL turned on my wife, blaming her for driving me away and not handling me better. The leeches were angry the host body was dry. My wife called me one last time before I changed my number, sobbing that they had to be out by Friday. She said her mom was going to shelter. Her sister was moving in with some random guy she met online, and she had to move back to her dad's trailer in Ohio, where there was no room. She admitted she didn't think I'd actually leave. She thought I'd just deal with it. I told her that was exactly the problem, and hung up. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. No assets to split, really. So I kept my savings in retirement. I drove by the old house recently and saw a for rent sign. I realized I hadn't just escaped a crowded house. I escaped a life of servitude. I've since been promoted. I'm traveling and my bank account is growing. I learned that no is a complete sentence.